Welcome to our Samuel Bak WebinART, focused on his new body of work entitled Unstill Life, which explores the themes of still life through his fractured lens of a life lived. What better genre to focus the discussion on Sam's work in the context of art history and of the still life. Historically, still life and nature mort, or dead nature, has been dominated by art that reflects the immediate world and the time during which the art was created. Today, we're thrilled to have this forum to discuss how Sam provides us with a personal and yet universal approach to still lives. We all, and Sam certainly, have lived through deeply disrupted times and disturbing events. This includes recent events like January the 6th and the assault on the Capitol, social unrest of enormous proportions associated not only with Black Lives Matter, but as well with social inequities of historical and immense scale. Artists are challenged to portray and transform these social and political events via their work and to reflect the drastic breaking of what used to be called normal. This is precisely what Sam's intense paintings do. As Brother Thomas wrote, artists are the discoverers and custodians of the unlooked for. They see beyond and yet stay the course. We begin with one of the most valued works in the gallery's collection, Sam's 1968 piece entitled 3210. It was clear even then, back in 1968, that his version of still life was one of transformation and impending disaster. With the tip of the brush to Morandi, Sam presents us with everyday objects made over into weapons of war. An armored protected bottle, as well as a rocket at blast-off, all alluding to the visual vocabulary of war and mass destruction. And today we have the great pleasure to welcome Professor Andrew Meyers, an independent art historian who has taught at Connecticut College and Columbia University, to explore many of these new works with an eye to the past and an awareness these works serve as a trenchant social commentary and questioning. As ever, there is no greater joy for me than being part of a conversation with Sam. Somehow, with the passage of time, decades at a leap, our friendship and bond of commonly held ideas and ideals has deepened to make our journey richer and more enriching. An important and very, very positive note, enormous progress continues apace toward the establishment of a Samuel Bak Museum and Learning Center on the campus of the University of Nebraska in Omaha. More about this amazing opportunity will be in our next webinar with the University of Nebraska Omaha professor, Mark Selensack, on the 20th of March. And now to Andy.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Sam, for this wonderful work, and Rose for pulling all of this together. So let's jump into the slideshow. The title which we constructed for this event is Samuel Bak's Disruption of Still Life, and I added to that the allegorizing of mindless matter into life. And I'd like to actually disrupt the idea of disruption a little bit. You know, I think that it's not so much a disruption as a conversation. And by the way, I would like this also to be a conversation. So at any point, Sam and Bernie, please jump in. And I see myself more as a tour guide than as on stage here. Sam is in conversation with the history of still life, referring, subverting, transforming, extending, and yes, disrupting, and has a relationship with the still life tradition of and I'm arguing, reclaiming the allegorical, reclaiming the role of allegory and meaning in a discipline, in a genre that sometimes eschewed the narrative and eschewed the allegorical for pure objective representation. In Sam's hands, still life becomes an opportunity for remembrance, for hidden meaning, for the narratives of loss, but also the narratives of repair. There is brokenness, clearly, but also hope. And as one interesting critic noted, there is still life in Sam's still lives. We were just talking before we began about the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, the repairing of the world, the healing of the world, and despite the life narrative that you may know or will learn about of Sam's own journey, there is, I think, a deep commitment to not just declaring the brokenness of the world and commenting upon it, but also of repairing it, and of bringing the political into still life through a human lens. So next slide, please.
Andy, I would argue also that beyond the political, there is the moral.
Absolutely.
And so I think that it is relatively important to keep that in mind, that we need to be both aware of both as you go through.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt, but on my screen, I do not see any projection of slides. Is it something that has to do with me, or it is something that has to do with the one who is the center of our webinar? I only see
I think
letters.
Yeah, so the slides are up and then we'll see images throughout.
We didn't see images. We just saw a black screen with letters. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get to the images very, very quickly. And by the way, I'm going to keep the narrative about the history of still life relatively brief, so we can move into looking at your work. So this is a Reader's Digest condensed, kind of opportunistic journey through still life to be able to use some of these examples to think a little bit about Sam's work. So as many of you may know, still life begins as the quote unquote lowest genre of art. It's in the academic hierarchy, in the hierarchy of the French Academy, and even before that in the Renaissance. It's seen as a low genre in part because it does not aspire to the allegorical, because it does not aspire to the heroic or to the grand, but is merely representing the talent of the artist. And it is only with the allegorizing of that mindless matter that the still life starts to be considered within with a higher status as part of the narrative of high art, beginning sort of towards the end of the Enlightenment. And then the first step we're going to look at is the Dutch still lives: flowers, breakfast, pronk, and game, and within that, the concept of the memento mori and vanitas, the use of still life to comment upon the world. In this case, from a Reformation perspective, of seeing the vanity of luxury and the ephemerality of the material. And then we move into the more modern 18th century version of the still life, which is the representation of the everyday and of virtuosity as the artist starts to rise in status, as the artist becomes an entrepreneur, as the middle class becomes the dominant consumer of art. Much of the metaphorical meaning of the still life is drained away in favor of representing the virtuosity of the artist and the celebration of everyday life. And that continues during the modern period with in France with Nature Morte in the 19th century, and then the modern move toward abstraction. And then we'll end talking about the 20th century and the return of allegory, specifically in the work of Samuel's, and the ways in which still life tries to address and capture the traumas of the modern. Next, please. So here is that narrative. Here you have that hierarchy, and poor still life. There it is, right down there at the bottom of this hierarchy under history painting, which is considered supreme because it addresses heroic and literary subjects. It's large scale, it's allegorical, it's didactic. Just underneath that, portraiture, then landscape, the celebration of nature, then genre painting, and still life down there at the bottom of the ladder. Next, please. So this just captures that narrative. Here you can see on the upper left, Poussin's Lamentation. And then if you go clockwise, you can see portraiture and landscape painting and genre painting. And then finally in the lower right, you see still life. And still life early on was seen as a way of demonstrating the virtuosity and talent of the artist. And its value was in the degree to which artists could achieve a kind of verisimilitude of the real, could show their virtuosity by hyperrealism in still life. Next, please. Next, please. So even before we have the still life, we have still lifes in situ. And the allegorical history of still lifes you can see as early as the Merode altarpiece attributed to Robert Campen in the 15th century. If you, next slide, please. If you drill down onto the table, first of all, I want to comment, I want to note the table, right? We still have, even with the verisimilitude and the accuracy, we still have vestiges of the medieval didactic form in tilting the table up, a certain disregard for perspective, because this is about teaching and about moral lessons. The Merode altarpiece is this devotional triptych. It's the center of which represents the Annunciation, where Mary finds out from the angel that she is going to give birth to Jesus. And I just throw this in here to show the way in which embedded in the still life, already even before it's called still life, is the notion of moral lessons and the notion of allegory. In this case, many of you will be familiar with this. The lilies and the water vessel represent Mary, the purity of Mary, that she is immaculately conceived, that the closed windows are a reference to her own virginity. The extinguished candle, where you see the smoke floating off, as a representation of the Holy Ghost, and the book, sitting on the table, clearly with the table tilted up so you can see it, is a representation of faith and devotion. And remember that table, because we'll be talking about that when we arrive at Sam's work. Next, please. Just another example from Holbein, the French ambassadors. Next slide, please. You can see here the still life that's embedded on that top shelf, representing the two liberal arts of astronomy and geometry with a celestial globe. This is all about showing how during the Enlightenment, the sciences are going to be elevated to a higher level, and how we're turning from looking to the skies for religious purposes to looking at the skies for scientific purposes. The celestial spheres of the human mind with divine reason and astronomical study and cosmology. So this still life places the new instruments of celestial navigation next to the celestial globe and redefines astronomy as not serving faith, but as applied astronomy, which is a practical and earthly art. Next, please. A short trip into the four categories of Dutch still life. The Dutch really establish the validity of still life. Next, please. With these four categories, we see in the upper left, we see flowers. And this one really captures that still life tradition of virtuosity and talent, right? This is about showing the technical skill of the artist. It is usually not allegorical. It will eventually lead into landscape painting. The lower left, we see the breakfast genre. And this is really a celebration of bourgeois plenty and also showing the artist's skill, the verisimilitude, just kind of showing off. And from this, we get the tradition of trompe-l'oeil and seeing painting as a three-dimensional window into the world rather than a two-dimensional representation. In the lower right, we see what's called the pronkstillen, the representation of ostentation. And this is one of the forms of vanitas that still life is trying to communicate to the viewer a life lesson of the emptiness of luxury and the transience of life. And that is most fully represented in these memento mori. In the upper right, you can see the representation of the coming of death. Next, please. This is Peter Klaas, Vanitas still life. You can see the oil lamp to the left with a little bit of smoke rising off from it. That's an oil lamp that's been snuffed out. You can see an empty glass that's turned over, and remember that when we return to Sam's work. So it is empty of the liquid, which represents life. It's been emptied. The gold watch, the passage of time, and the skull. And you may know the narrative of the Roman generals, when they returned, the emperors and generals, when they returned to Rome for their celebration of a victory, they always had a slave or an assistant who would be whispering in their ear, don't forget that you too shall die. Memento mori. Remember that we all die. And this is where still life starts to elevate into the realm of the great in the academic narrative by addressing questions of significance, by addressing death, by addressing the limitations of the earthly. I think it's also interesting in terms of the limited palette that Klaas chooses to use. We should also recall that for our later discussion. Next, please. So then we move into the 18th century. Next. And someone who I think is relevant as part of the conversation that Sam does have with this tradition. This is Chardin, Kitchen Still Life from 1733. Chardin is famous for these simple domestic scenes, which were remarkable for their clear, balanced compositions, their technical virtuosity, a celebration of both the everyday and the virtuosity of the artist. And you have to remember, in the historical moment, the bourgeoisie is now replacing the aristocracy as the primary consumer of art, or beginning to, at least. And the artist is beginning to rise in terms of their status in society. And so the changing nature of patronage, the rise of art as a commodity, the bourgeois celebration of the everyday, the notion of the heroic artist, which really starts to emerge in the 19th century. All of this you can see the glimmers of in the way that Chardin approaches the still life. Rich colors, even if the palette is relatively narrow. Less a celebration of the verisimilitude, less a celebration of the artist's skill, but a real deep look at the everyday, but not really a significant element of allegory or commentary. Next, please. And we see this continue as we move into the French nature morte in the 19th century. Next, please. In the 20th century. the de-Allegorization of the still life. And as we move into the modern moment, especially when we look at Cézanne's still lifes, which are so well known and well regarded, the desire to explore pure color and pure form, to recognize the importance of perspective and the perspective of the artist again elevated in his or her role, the artist's viewpoint and perspective from a technical vantage point, flattening and abstraction to the point where, famously, these peaches could roll off the table, and the celebration of the actual act of painting, the tactile nature of paint, the hand of the painter, as opposed to trompe-l'oeil and verisimilitude. These peaches almost are as if they're Velcro to the canvas. They're defying gravity. This is not about the painter showing this photographic capacity, and some people have pointed out that with the rise of mechanical photography, that aspect of painting became much less necessary. But there's also an aspiration to this modern moment, this sort of modern subjective position, where we're really seeing the experience of the artist. And this kind of Platonic notion in the case of Cézanne, which we'll see, I think, extended in Morandi, where the artist is trying to find perfect forms, the sphere, the cone, the cylinder, in nature, representing the perfection behind what is observable. Next, please. And pardon me for racing through this, but I want to get to Sam's work. And of course, Picasso. You can't talk about modern still life without talking about Picasso. This is still life from 1918. A celebration of, a commentary upon the flatness of the canvas. This is not a window into a three-dimensional reality. This is a dismantling of academic illusionism. This is a celebration of the modern, of the relative, the subjective mind of the artist. Of course, Freud plays into this moment as well. And of course, the disruption of World War I, the disruption of history, the disruption of meaning, the disruption of continuity with the tradition of still life, the sort of modern alienation from history, and in some cases from meaning. The next, please. And then almost done with the history. Giorgio Morandi, still lifes from the 1940s. I think the tonal subtlety of this, the simplicity of the objects, this is definitely an inheritance from Cézanne, but an extension of it into this geometricizing of form. The breakdown that comes with World War I, literally in Morandi's case, turns him toward this very reduced form and reduced palette and pure geometry. It's really the beginning of what will eventually become minimalism. And I think the purity of this is something which we see Sam playing with in some of his work. Next, please. But this moment with Cézanne and Picasso and Morandi is an anti-allegorical moment. It's a withdrawal from the allegorical, and it's with the surrealists and the Dadaists that you start to getting a return of allegory. And so I think this is an interesting comparison from Sam's work to Morandi's work. And I'll be interested once we move into the last portion of this to hear Sam's what Sam really finds in Morandi beyond the formal, because I see, Sam, your work as enjoying the geometry of Morandi, but integrating it with a return to the allegorical. And I don't know if maybe this is a moment for you to.
Yes, well, I must say I have discovered Morandi when I lived in Italy. And Morandi was certainly one of the artists that I admired enormously. He was part of a certain group of the Italian Metaphysica, so it was not alone. I was quite aware of that. And what amazed me always was the quintessential simplicity of his work, that every touch was just right, was not compared, the best Morandis were painted within half an hour. A good day's work were about 5 paintings or so. So I was incredibly jealous of his ability to catch light and atmosphere and dematerialize the painting. That actually, on one hand, you love the way that his brush touched the canvas. On the other hand, you felt that you look into a certain space where things are happening. Now, on the screen now you see my painting called In Search of Morandi, because if you look well, it has the letters Morandi in the painting itself. But actually, this is also quite representative of what I'm doing, because I'm always creating things from fragments that come from elsewhere. And I guess, I don't know, because I think in every art, there is a part of autobiography, of telling one's own story. I remember that when the Second World War was still going on, we were liberated in June by the Russian army. I was about 10 years of age. About a month after that, my mother found for me already a teacher for art, teacher of painting, Professor Serafinovich, who went to the building where they had the school for fine arts with sculptures in plaster and so on. And it was bombed, and she found fragments of noses, ears, heads, and so on. She brought to her place. And I started to make these very academic drawings when I was about 10 or 11 of these fragments. And these fragments somehow remained, of course, then transformed through the fragmentation that the Cubists did, that Picasso did in the paintings that you have shown before, and so on. But this fragmentation is somehow also related to very much to my observation as a child of what it is that you do art.
Thank you so much. My goodness, that was such a great journey into some of your early sources. And yeah, I would argue that the influence of Morandi in this case has more to do with your technical side as opposed to the allegorical, if you will, right? Let's go to the next slide, because now we do have the return of the allegorical, and I think from that same time period, next please, we get another set of influences. These are not specific influences, but these are just exemplary of Dada and Surrealism. And it seems to me, we're not going to talk about your use of landscape and how you insert the still life into the landscape, but some of the juxtapositions, some of the uncanny, disturbing, unsettling, provocative juxtapositions, I think, do come from your experience of surrealism, you know, in this modern moment. Certainly, the surrealists celebrated the return of allegory, but or at least the return of meaning and interpretation. But rather than the subjectivity of pure perspective, as in the case of Picasso, you have the subjectivity of the subconscious, right? And you have the subconscious experience, the personal experience of the artist. Obviously, Freud and psychoanalysis contributes to this, and the disturbances and the perturbations of World War I. In this case, we have Pierre Roy on the left, Still Life with Bottles and Breton Bonnets from 1924, same year. Miro on the right, Bottle of Wine. These uncanny juxtapositions, these collapsed spaces, the individual voice. We also see the return of the kind of floating quality of medieval art, which had been discarded in the still lifes of the Dutch. Medieval still lifes, to the extent they existed, were religious paintings against this floating background of gold. And here we see that kind of floating background return, and these strange representations. You have the eyeball on top of the bottle of wine, the combination of the objective and the subjective through these uncanny representations. Next, please. And that brings us to the part where I do hope both Sam and Bernie will please jump in, because my argument really is, Sam, that you have not just a disruption of still life, but a conversation with these painters, a conversation with these
I
techniques.
absolutely agree. Yeah.
And that you bring all of these traditions kind of together selectively, depending upon your intentions for each. So next, please, Rose. So here we have the Memento Mori of Class. We have the Morandi, and we have the work that that Bernie, you introduced at the beginning of our time together. And it seems to me, Sam, that you are sort of drawing
very well together. Very well together.
Yeah.
They belong to the same
so
thing.
maybe you might just sort of comment. I'm not saying that this was your conscious, journey, but I think there are elements of those traditions you're drawing from.
Art is always a conscious way of working that allows the subconscious to enter and participate. So I would say that I saw a big exhibition in the Centre Pompidou in Paris of Lucien Freud. And in that exhibition, there was a very big wall on which there was a quote of Lucien Freud that explained his painting. And the quote was very short. It said, "Art comes from art." And I think every painter knows it. Every painter knows it. My work has been sometimes defined as surrealism. But when I was young, surrealism was a very dirty word. Surrealism was really something that was an absolute taboo. You did not touch that. And I very much tried to be a modern painter and so on. And when I started to paint in the genre that I'm painting now since a few decades, which was around 64, 65, I had already then a certain reputation as an abstract painter and so on. It was provocative. It was provocative. It was a kind of a tikkun, in a sense that mainly because I then moved to Israel from Italy, and I saw that Israel's disconnection from the big world, because it was still a hard time. Artists knew, local artists knew what is going on in the world from reproductions in books, not because they saw these things. And there was more and more going on a tendency to a certain kind of Parisian abstraction and so on. I wanted to be provocative. I wanted to find somewhere in the garbage the baby that was thrown out together with the water of the bathroom and bring it back. So I did not think of surrealism, not at all. And if one knows the complexity of the word surrealism, I mean, Salvador Dali was the great surrealist who influenced Breton and his group, and then they split. And then Dali said the great difference between the surrealists and me is that I'm a surrealist. So
that's lovely. Yeah.
Was somehow, but now I don't care, because my paintings are called postmodern, surrealist, conceptual, and so on. I must say that I was very much influenced by conceptual art, because I think that conceptual art was a certain way of doing surrealism in museums, which after the end of the exhibition threw out the stuff or put it in the basement to rot. Installations. So I decided, well, I will paint my installations on canvases. So you see, it's extremely complicated to use these words that have so many connotations. It depends from where they come.
So, Andy, I would just add that in showing Sam's work over a period of time, what is the greatest invitation in each of the pieces is that the objects are recognizable and the context is not, and the meaning is not. So everyone can identify the cut pear and the knife and so on, but what the invitation is then for people to enter into the world that Sam has presented them with and the questions that he's presented them with. And that in a way somehow moves his work beyond the past, but at the same time represents all of his respect for the past.
It's beautifully put. Yeah, and in this particular work, which you started off with, I think there's also an interesting way in which, if we argue that this is a return of the allegorical, in the sense it's a return of representing through objects other meanings, going all the way back to the Dutch, it's filtered through, Sam, both your personal life experience and the disruptions in your life, including that of the war and the Holocaust, but also in the context, since this is 1968-69, clearly there's a political subtext, right, and a moral subtext that has to do with instruments of war and instruments of destruction.
Yes, yes. You know, I say something about my still life, which I think was it's certainly important that I saw in what I'm doing, because you see, when I survived what I survived, that I came to Israel and I lived among survivors, it was a place where life still went on. I mean, each one of these people was somebody who lost family, who lost children. My mother married a widower who lost his wife and children in a camp. And my mother had lost her husband and so on. And we lived among people who were still alive and who very much pretended not to be broken as they were in reality, not to be some who were rich and became poor, some who were secular and became religious and so on, not even being able to reveal their own substance. So for me, I say all these still lives is a certain way of representing the world, in the specific world in which I lived among survivors. It was not so much speaking of the Holocaust, it was speaking of the aftermath. I mean, my biggest still life that I have painted is called The Family. It hangs in the Packer Gallery.
Which is, in fact, Andy, a collection of bodies, faces, heads, and all different materials, all of which I think have personal connections to Sam in many ways, and at the same time represent the memories of all of the confrontation that he had with those survivors, and that there was still life. There was a sense of continuing that goes on. So this is just one of the pieces that we're going to look at, but I think it's an important stepping off point.
Next, please. There we go. You develop, Sam, a very complex set of metaphors and set of symbols, and without suggesting that they only mean one thing, I thought it might be interesting to explore some of those. You know, I asked Rose to sort of help me because she's experienced even more of your oeuvre. Pears, teapots, chests, handles, spoons, candles, fire, flame, nails, the hammer. You know, clearly in this work, the uncanniness of the juxtapositions of these various elements suggests that there are meanings to these arrows and pears and mirrors and I thought it might be interesting, just not by any means to sort of pin you down to one meaning, because the glory of these things is that they're open to multiple interpretations. But given that you give us this funny little clue in the upper right, which is your own reproduction of what is a Cezanne.
Yeah.
I threw up the Cezanne. Cezanne has none of those ambitions. At least
no, I had no ambition. But I mean, Cezanne, whom I admire enormously, and speaking of precision, we saw before the Dutch painting, and I had at a certain point the ambition of showing that I can be almost as precise as the Dutch with the paintings that you have seen before, with the still life that you have seen before. In this still life of mine, what you see much more is a technique that belongs to a couple of centuries after after that. And I'm very conscious of that, because what I know is that I can paint in my ability. I could paint from a Mondrian to a Van der Weyden and so on, because this is just technique, this is nothing. But I must say, for instance, in this specific painting, I was certainly very much influenced by an artist that I admire enormously since also the years in Italy where I discovered his work, was Saul Steinberg. And the use of Saul Steinberg as letters and words that say something. And so this painting is a serious painting, but the seriousness of this painting is seriosity. It is hope. I mean, what the painting here says is hope. It's that you can see very well the H, and O, a P, and the E. And I started to paint paintings with hope because people asked me, Mr. Bak, is there absolutely no hope in your paintings? So I said, I will show them that there is hope in my paintings, and I painted paintings with hope. Of course, I took it from Steinberg. But the hope here is somehow the world of the absurd. Or let's say the world that I, as a student of art who came to Paris in the mid-50s, was projected into. It was the world of the absurd. It was Ionesco, it was Samuel Beckett, it was all that enormous intellectual weight. And as a young artist, I know is that I must hit the target. I must just find what it is exactly my way. And then I realized there is no such thing. It's a matter of choice. It's a matter of having too many possibilities is very difficult. You have to make choices. You have to give up something. You pick up something else. So here you have these arrows that try somehow to find a target, which is placed against the chair on the right, but one by mistake has hit a pear. And so, but there is always hope. There is always hope every time that I take the keys of my car and I go, let's say, to the pharmacy to pick up anything. I say, I hope I won't have an accident.
I've always seen the irony in your work, but now I see the downright.
It's serious irony. It's serious irony. I mean, irony in art is a sine qua non. Irony is art is the only thing that gives us really perspective. That gives us perspective and allows us to see what is the real weight of things. I mean, the moment we lose irony, we start to take ourselves seriously, is the end.
Well, and I also appreciate the fact that the most interesting arrows are the ones which miss their target. The one that hits its target is off screen.
Yeah.
It's also helpful, but I have always loved this painting. It's a very small painting, Sam. It's hung in my office for a while. And for me, the joy of it has been the irony that you mentioned, because the O was a mirror and it's broken. Yeah. So the notion that hope comes with all of your baggage of disarray, of disruption, and yet on the wall is the reminder that there was this much calmer sense of still life. And I love the juxtaposition of the frame of the Cézanne look-alike, and then the window with this wonderful sense that nature's there, that the world seems to be beautiful. It's a great day, green of the tree.
So this incredibly indifferent to us.
Absolutely. And then the table, which you'll get back to, maybe, because it seems that there are so many paintings and so many words that go with the paintings, we may not get there. But this table is one of my favorites, because if that table is actually able to stand, then you are a magician.
But it does recall both the table of the late medieval period and also the tables of the Cubists, right?
Absolutely. And so I love that. And then your fidelity to the materials, so that there's wood and there's fabric, there's glass, there's the texture of the pear, of the tree. Everything has a reality to it. And yet when you step back from it, you're only left with irony rather than reality.
Next, please. That's beautifully said. I put up this juxtaposition only because of its suggestive quality. I'm not making an argument that you drew from the Pierre Roy bottles and bonnets, but it's just the uncanny nature of it, the juxtapositions, the materiality of it they all seem to be there seemed to be a kinship between these two images. The bonnets are the bonnets of the local women, in Breton. And they improbably end up on top of the bottles, which gives the bottles this anthropomorphic aspect. So I just throw that up as and yet I feel like for all of the technical or formal similarities, the intention of your work is very different.
Yes, I mean, in this specific painting, this is another version, is a smaller version of a large painting that I was planning. And it is related to my paintings of the commemoration of Vilna and the ghetto of Vilna. And actually the color of night here is represented in the still life that becomes in Polish a natura morta, which comes from Italian, which means dead nature. So the death and the color of night somehow related to these objects. And you can see the ghetto is returning almost like a scenery that comes down from the ceiling of the stage of the theater. Speaking of these houses, the houses were made out of fabric of the yellow stars of David that identified us. And there is also a hint of these gates and the arches that are very typical of Vilna. And the entire table here, of course, is something that represents the terrible instability and unsureness of life of that time. So this painting has specifically a greater dose of Holocaust-related meaning.
We talk about the Natura Morta and the Vanitas paintings. These are rather digestible expressions of concepts of death, yeah, and of the passage of time. And how do you feel that the still? How do you take the still life and make it possible for it to contain these much more tragic life experiences? The Klaus is not referring to an apocalypse. You're really bringing to this genre a much more powerful and morally laden set of traumas.
Well, I think that I must say, when I create a work, the idea and the story behind and all these are not things that I kind of intellectually prepare. They are coming from me because they are in me, because I am who I am, and I just write my diary. There are some writers who are only known because of the diaries they wrote. And I would say that all my art, whether these are landscapes or whether these are still lifes or whether these are figures or if these were semi-abstractions that I did before and so on, they're kind of diaries. They're intimate diaries of mine in which I am telling, first of all, to myself, but also certainly to other people, because I'm very lucky that my art is being seen by other people, is being researched, is being understood, is being used for the triggering of conversations and so on. This is absolutely wonderful. But I do not see. I mean, I'm beyond these classifications that existed, as you so very well described, beginning with historical painting. I think that you can paint a historical painting with a still life. I mean, this for me is a historical still life. It has to do with the ghetto in which some 40 or 50,000 people were murdered. So, and that is this incredible privilege that we have in our times, that we can do that, because fortunately artists were given incredible freedom that they did not have in the previous centuries.
There is in this painting, Sam and Andy, for me, the issue of manipulation, not only of set designs being lifted and so forth, there's a sense of destruction, of flames. Even some of the windows replicate the shapes of the Ten Commandments. So to somehow weave it all together and to realize that each one of us brings our own experiences to it is, for me, the miracle of Sam's work. It opens up a discussion rather than the still life limiting it to vanitas, to this or to that. And the fact that he is able to both draw upon his own particular personal memories of experiences and at the same time then open it up to a universal discussion is what art can do at its very best.
Bernie, this was a very good remark, because these suspended items, I mean, I have painted so many paintings that you know, with these ropes that come from above, where actually they are a kind of puppeteer's control over what goes down here, and who is this great puppeteer. Who knows? I mean, some people call the great puppeteer Buddha, some call him Jesus, some call him Elohim, some, I mean, we don't know, I don't know, but all I feel is that I'm also pulling some strings.
That's lovely.
That's well said. Next comparison. And I did want to maybe talk about the pear.
Yeah.
It's obviously such a dominant figure. It may be the forbidden fruit. It may be, classically it's the female form. It may be you. We've seen it ossified. We've seen it cleaved. Here we see a kind of hypertrophic version of the candle from the classical still life, going all the way back to the Marot altarpiece, leaning up and against and dripping upon the off-kilter pear. What does the pear, and of course also its associations with Cézanne, what does the pear provide for you?
Well, it provides for me a subject of research. It's now 50 years that I'm trying to understand what it means. And I hope to go on with that. It provides very many things. It has something dynamic. For instance, in the Cézanne, you can see the roundness of the apples, and you can see suddenly the pears end up with a point. And this is like two different melodies that are changed into variations of a different kind. But all that you mentioned before, the female form and so on, I started actually to explore the pears when I came to Israel. I think it was in '67. I was invited to have an exhibition of about 8 paintings of my work in a large exhibition that was prepared by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris, of Israeli young artists. I painted a group of 8 paintings for the show. The show was annulled. The show never took place, and I remained with the paintings. But these 8 paintings were 8 variations of the pear. And I chose the pear because I thought, well, they're going to France. What do the French know about a pear? That a pear can mean something more than just a pear. I thought of Daumier's treatment of Louis Philippe, and this caricature of Louis Philippe by Daumier. And then I thought of the meaning of the word pear, poire, which means is somebody a little kind of childish, a little stupid, somebody whom you can manipulate. And the somebody whom you can manipulate became for me the pear. I took the pear and I made it in different, in a kind of different suggestions of size, of substance, of matter, and so on. And it started from there. And with time, it has acquired a very intriguing substance for me, for myself. And I'm trying to work on, I mean, as I told you, it's not an intellectual game where I say A means this, and B means that, and C means yet another thing. All these things kind of come from themselves, and they are very much the result, in certain cases, of simply a formal research. So it's open to conversation.
Which I'm happy to share if you want, Andy, but I don't need to, which is that for me, the pairs have always been an intriguing triangle that Sam has manipulated in so many different ways. This one particularly reminiscent of a later exhibit on candles, just simply devoted to ner ot, which is the plural of candle, but divided into two words. It's candle as a symbol. The idea that life burns out, all these things, the wax of the burnt candle become teardrops. They accumulate at the base of it. All this kind of monumental sense that this could be a sculpture, but were it a sculpture, then it wouldn't be as interesting as it is as a painting. So the invitation into the ambiguity of the meaning. And then Sam is always very helpful by giving titles when they're all done, and they generally are not helpful at all.
Well, one thing I'll just comment on, that's very, very interesting and helpful, Bernie, is that in looking at your work, Sam, is that you say that the pair is like this childish, naive character whom you can manipulate.
Oh, this is by the French, not for me.
No, not by you, but you do exploit the pair, and you do all sorts of you do all sorts of things to it, and yet I sense a kind of, there's an endearment as well. There's a love of it that's expressed.
You're right.
In your treatment of it.
You're right, because there are several languages that live in me due to the circumstances of. I wrote about it when my father smuggled me out from the labor camp, which was the way that I said goodbye to my father. I never saw him after that. After that, he was shot by the Nazis. But when he smuggled me out, I had a feeling that he was carrying me in a sack on his back. It was like a pregnancy. So it was my father gave me life. He took me out of the camp, and he died in that pregnancy. And the pair is also the French word for père, for father. Mm-hmm. So the père is in Hebrew means glory. So in this painting with the candle, there is a certain desire that I have to evoke almost religious glory of the sky and so on, something that would be related to some Renaissance painting. So you see how complex these things are, and they come to my mind as a post-mortem. I mean, right. After I painted it. Because when I paint it, I don't think of all these things. They're just being born, and they tell me what to do. I start a canvas, just a few lines and so on, and it tells me what to do. So that's how it is.
It's called artistic psychoanalyst.
Yeah.
As therapy. Next, please.
Which is perfect for this painting. And the title.
Still Life with Ego. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And I put the Magritte up as just an intriguing parallel. I don't think you were riffing off of the Magritte, but yeah. I'd like you to talk a little bit about sort of the quality of the uncanny, because there are these qualities of there's something which is recognizable and yet it's wrong. It's familiar and yet it's unsettling. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the uncanny in your work.
Well, we spoke before about there is a certain irony. There is, of course, a huge irony when you see this little pair, a very little pair that you can remark in the very middle of the painting against the clear sky in this empty space in the middle of the pear, and then its ego is this imaginary projection of the enormous pear in which this stands. Is the ego. I mean, we project our entire world in which we live as an emanation of our own selves. I mean, we understand the world, we understand what is good about it, what is bad about it, thanks to our scale of values. So in a certain way, our view of the world is this superego. So when I painted this little landscape with, it's funny. I mean, I think that humor is a part of my art. And I think that what I would like to reach is the tragedy and humor that I find in Chekhov.
Interesting.
I think here, Andy, more than anything else, this is a very relatively large painting in Sam's body of work that we have. And so in the presence of the painting, and as good as the reproduction is on the screen, it really is stunning to see this monumental, if you will, ego presented. And yet inside it, as if the mechanics of the ego still are these small still life objects, that it centers Sam's work for me around the pear and the still life. These are the most intimate of his paintings from my perspective. The chess pieces are metaphorical, the wonderful use of the knights, and so, but here there's a confrontation with us as human beings and our own emotional and psychological presence. And this really, really mandates that we pay attention to that idea.
Very powerful. My initial reaction to it recalled to me in a humorous way, and in a more intimate way, Ozymandias, the notion of and which goes back to the vanitas, right? That look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, right? And yet you see it as a ruin, and so there is a sense of humor, Sam, that you have towards the ego and maybe your own ego and your own sense of self, which is very, I think, humanizing, even as you're representing this grandiose and slightly tragic, monument.
Therefore, it's been very wonderful to work together with him.
Next, please. And I think that's our last one. Yes, is that our last one, or did you add one, Rose?
I added some more just in case you guys are fiending to talk some more.
And if you're willing, Andy, I'd love to look at a couple of pieces that you haven't even prepared for, to have some of your perspective, and then to have Sam's as well, because I'm just sitting here smiling.
What's the next one, Rose? Oh yeah, that's your comparison. So maybe you'd like to tell us where that comes from.
Well, actually, it's mine. So I apologize for that. But let's go back to the one before, because I think almost absent presence is also a very important painting. And you're on, Andy.
Well, yeah. So I had put this in as the conclusion, just because I was thinking about that quote that there is still life, and absent presence. Obviously, there's postmodernist allusions and so forth, but the reclamation of meaning and of allegory and of narrative and of humor, I think, is a very powerful gesture in this longer narrative of the still life, that even after war, death, loss, there is the possibility of understanding and reparation and healing. And I just see in your work and in this particular piece a kind of optimism, a hopefulness, which belies the challenging narrative of the 20th century and of your own life, that I find very inspiring. And so I just wanted to end on this particular piece, with that with the note of thanks for the.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, I can just say a few words about this specific painting because when I look at it today, I remember what brought me to paint it was my thought of these very different wanderings that I did from one counter to another counter and so on, and how people usually try to assemble and to create an identity that belongs to the group. And this has to do, this is the, if you want, the pair club. Here they are all belonging. I mean, they are all these items, let's say, are playing golf. They are all together. They belong to the same synagogue. They are, so this kind of togetherness that takes away the individuality and this tension that continues between our desire to belong and at the same time to keep our freedom, more or less.
But there are also so much in this, Sam, that you continue to go back to the picture, the pear, the cup, the bottle, and the overriding pair with the Xing out, which continually represents the notion of loss, of death, of not lack of presence, a suggested possible cross. All these things in, and Andy, I think it is important at least to talk a little about placing these objects in nature, in a landscape. The landscape itself on the right is heavy with stones and so forth, but in the far left, there are the monumental dinosaur pairs that have been here long before we got here and probably will be here long after us. So the notion of just having the two of you here to just look at the paintings together, and that's why I actually first apologize to people who thought that this was going to be over an hour. But secondly, to say that we should look at least one of the newer paintings, and also to direct you all to an e-catalog. Many of you who got the catalog think that there are only 50 paintings in this collection. The e-catalog actually presents 109 works that Sam has done over the past few years on this theme. And so hopefully what we've done today, and with this last painting we'll try to do again, is to create for you a vocabulary of questions and access routes to engaging with each and every piece. So I'm grateful to Andy, grateful to Sam, but let's look at the last piece if we can, Rose. Pieces. And Sam, why don't you begin? But this particular one was put in because of the table. And to see where you are with the table and then tell you sort of where I was when I saw it.
It's very strange. I remember that I painted this painting and the leg of the table was not yet on fire. But then I remembered the very early, this was, I think, the very first days in the ghetto, when I heard, no, maybe it was when refugees from Poland occupied by the Germans found their way to Vilna. There must have been about, I think, 15 or 20,000 people who came from Poland occupied by the Germans. And they went through Vilna, and we had at home quite a lot of refugees. I had to give up my room. Family was sleeping. And I remember they were singing a song in Yiddish, which was called Brennt, Kinderlachs brennt. It means it burns, children, it burns, our world is burning down, and so on. And I thought, well, I'm painting here these Shabbos candles on a table, and even if the tablecloth tries to be extremely monumental and extremely strong and keep it, yet at the same time, the table is going to burn down.
And it also, Sam, for me, the table, not in the card players as much, but in yours, is a form of an altar on which so much desecration takes place.
Yeah, sure.
that the notion of the burning, the destruction, the offerings, the sacrifices all show up in a painting like this. And even the tablecloth comes down as feeling to me like teardrops. There's a sense of movement in the tablecloth itself, so that all this comes together, and I look at it and say, oh my, once again, because you've created an opportunity for the viewer to engage. And look at the juxtaposition of your tablecloth and the curtain in the Cézanne. There's a sense of quiet stability, even the cloak on the man on the right, as you look at it. And here there's a sense of unease.
You're absolutely right. I mean, Cézanne didn't learn from me anything, but I learned a lot from him.
I think that's a perfect way for Rose to announce who are the winners, or the winner of the piece. Andy, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Andy, very much. I love your presentation, and I loved how you have put me into art history.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing this time with me.
And thank you all for being here, and thank you everyone who is attending right now and being patient and going over with us. But we had an essay contest, so a maximum of 500 words, and people focused on an image or two from the current exhibition. So congratulations to Susan Nashman Freeman for her essay, which is the winning essay today, which is inspired by time repair. And on the right-hand side is your prize of a beautiful signed lithograph. So congratulations. I encourage you all to register if you haven't already for the next event. And remember, the e-catalog is available in the chat, but also online. So thank you guys so much for speaking with us and being here. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.